It's a hot one in the garage today, but it's time to get back to work on the 240 and get this supercharger buttoned up and ready to run. On the agenda today, we have a intake that needs a gasket made and mounted. We have some wiring to clean up. We have a supercharger belt that needs to be finished and routed correctly. Some other accessory belts to do, as well as some other miscellaneous accessory stuff, and everything in the engine bay should be done today. Starting here with mounting the power steering belt that also drives the water pump. That is a nice thing that the belt that drives the supercharger only drives the supercharger and the alternator. So if that belt were to go, A, we would see the loss of voltage real quick, and B, we wouldn't lose water pump. So if we happen to lose that belt, the thing that I notice wrong is not the water temp shooting up. That would be sucky. I find it interesting that these Japanese cars always use this style of tensioner, where the bracket for the actual accessory moves instead of a separate tensioner pulley. Interesting that we're now adding a American-style tensioner pulley to the supercharger to keep that belt tight. So now to tighten the supercharger belt, I am going to first tighten down the idler. Now this idler has a stack of washers behind it, and I may need to take one more washer out of it to get it to be in the center of the belt versus how it was on his car. So the adjustment for the supercharger belt tension is pretty simple. Just push down on this pulley and then tighten it down when the tension seems right. This is my first time really putting tension on it, and I do notice a little bit of a problem that the belt is wanting to interfere with the space that the alternator bolt is currently occupying. We don't want those two talking to each other. So I go ahead and pull that bolt out, and what I think I can do is just cut off the washer and spacer that are on the bolts. There are, they heat those up and put them on there, and then when they form the thread of the bolt, they're pretty much locked in. So it needs to be cut off of there. I have some good flat washers that I can put on there in place of these, and that should buy us quite a bit of space. It's always important to have a gentle touch when it comes to car modification. That takes care of the spacer. I'm going to knock off the regular washer that was on there too and replace it with a bigger flat washer. Shouldn't be a problem in the future. I don't see any reason that those needed to be there. Also, the head of this bolt is pretty massive, and I think we can get away with shaving a little bit off of it. I'm also going to taper one side of it so that if we need to buy a little bit more space with this thing, we can, and just angle the head of the bolt down and have it facing where the belt is. So there is our finished product. A little bit of a tapered head, definitely much shorter, and taking out that big spacer should make us not have any problems whatsoever. That's a mission complete. Now just to tighten the sucker down, and now it doesn't have to move at all. The alternator stays in place, it never moves to tension the belt, so we can just tighten it all the way down. Now we move on to cleaning up the intake. This was a piece that was made by Grant, so he cut this out of metal and basically formed it with some exhaust tubing and things like that. It's not the prettiest piece in the world, and in the future when we're really fine-tuning this car, it's one of the things that I think I would like to redo or improve on. But for now, we're going to keep it as it was. Just going to clean this up and try and sand it a little bit smooth. I do want this to be pretty airtight. This is post-throttle body, so it's more like an intake manifold than the intake on your normal car. Any air that gets in past this point is going to be bypassing the throttle body, and we don't want that. So even all cleaned up and sanded down, it's still not perfect. So what I have purchased is the same material that I think he used on this, and Felpro makes it. You can buy gasket material in a sheet. You can get paper, or you can get this. This is fiber reinforced rubber style. I find that it works phenomenal for this kind of purpose. It also takes ultra gray RTV very well, so if I use both of those in combination, I think we're going to have a good seal. And judging by what I scraped off of there, I'm going to say that's what he did as well. Now comes the process of cutting that piece into the right size gasket. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, especially since I'm going to RTV it, but I want it to be as close as possible. So what I did is just ran a socket along the inside of where I thought the circle would be, where the hole opening is, and that hole opening is also not a perfect circle, so Just drawing a circle out didn't really do the trick, but this seemed to have pretty much matched what I needed. Once I ensured that the hole opening was not larger than it needed to be, then I can just cut the outside of it and finish up detailing the inner circle layer. That doesn't need to happen right now. We need to get the basic shape of it cut first. This thing is such a funky shape that it didn't want to leave a nice impression on the sheet, so I did end up using a bit of a marker to trace out the size of it. The outside edges don't really matter. If it's too large, there's enough space around this thing on the Supercharger that it shouldn't be an issue. Now we just use our kindergarten training to cut out the shape and see how we did. This is not too shabby. I think it'll work. The next part is doing the holes for the bolts, and I actually have a nice little trick for you for doing that, and that is to take a bolt that is just slightly larger than the bolt you're using and use that to punch out the hole for the gasket. Usually, like the head bolts and things like that, any kind of real good bolt has a very sharp thread right at the end, and that sharp thread is great for punching a hole through any kind of gasket material and is way easier than trying to cut one out by hand. She's a beaut. Once a gasket that didn't exist, now a gasket that exists. Alright, now I have lathered this up with a nice thin layer of Ultra Gray RTV on each side, which is keeping it firmly in place. And now comes the part of actually mounting it. I can already tell that through the history and future of this car, taking this particular piece off will become a royal pain in the butt. I'll have to try and figure out a solution for that in the future, especially if it becomes an issue, like having to take it on and off again, because as of now, it is just a nightmare getting these bolts in and out. The current setup has one stud at the top and then the rest are bolts. I'm wondering now if I shouldn't get 4 actual studs. The one stud that's in there is actually just a bolt that had the head cut off, and maybe like red Loctite those in there so that those are retained in the Supercharger. The nuts, I think, are maybe a little bit easier to deal with than trying to get the bolts through there, and are less likely to cross thread. That's what I'm most worried about, to have to, like, I don't know, helicoil these bolt holes in the Supercharger. But with that mounted up, and letting it dry before I tighten it down, there's one thing that I should probably do and test, and that is hooking up the battery to see if the chassis power is actually still working. All looks good there, and even the window went down after it unstuck itself from not moving for 2 years. After letting that guy set up for a while, I tightened it down, and now it is firmly attached, and we're going to install the other side of the intake. Now this side is one that is very high up on my needs to be redesigned list. The tubing for this is A, exhaust tubing, so it's thick wall and it doesn't need to be. And 2, it is smaller than the rest of the intake in the entire system. It is 2 1/4 inside diameter. The intake of the manifold side is 2 1/2, and the inlet for the Supercharger itself is 2 1/2. You would think that you would want that to all be 2 1/2 so that the air can flow freely and it can have as much air as it would like. We'll cross that bridge another day. For now, we'll leave it like it is and hook up the throttle and see that that is working and gets its full range. That went together nice and easy, and it seems like we have 0% throttle and 100% throttle. Next up, I'm going to put in the radiator. It has the cooling fan on there for now. This cooling fan will be retired here shortly, as we will be creating a lot more heat. We'll need a lot more fan. Upon getting that in there, I noticed that the lower radiator hose is wanting to share the space of the alternator and Supercharger belts and pulleys, so I'm going to need to shorten that radiator hose up somehow, probably down at the base where the radiator is. That does look like the solid way to go, so we'll just take a few inches out of the bottom, and that should give us the clearance that we need. Assuming my weak little self can manage to cut through this hose. Good job. Now back on it goes, and one thing that is nice is that I managed to keep the original protectors for this lower radiator hose. It's a new hose, but kudos to me, somehow I managed to keep track of these protectors, and that will be nice. That'll give us a little bit of protection against the spinning objects around it. Back in the radiator goes. This is actually a 2-row aluminum radiator. It has served me very well, and it does look like the modifications to the hose have solved all of those problems. The upper radiator hose shouldn't be an issue either. I'll take that head nod as a success, and I guess that's pretty much it for things that needed finishing up in the engine bay. Okay, so it's actually really close now. That is everything that I need to do to it to get ready for Grant to come over and help me with the final details of the computer stuff. So we have here the intake all done. I've put the fan controller in. This is just the fan controller for that guy. That will get upgraded in the future. We got power distribution here. I'm going to get a different post for this. I got to get an eyelet for that. So when I say I'm done, I mean I'm done as far as stuff that's like interesting for video. Still some little stuff to touch up along the way. He has a cap for the distributor, so I'll be able to take the distributor out completely and just put a cap in there in the future. The wiring isn't super clean, and I might be able to tidy it up even more in the future, but it's good enough for now. I am not a person obsessed with cleanliness. Need to get a filter for this. It will no longer pull from the intake, it will pull from atmosphere. There was one little bit of a issue here on the upper radiator hose. It is hitting the intake here. I don't see a way to get around that, so we may just have to make some kind of plastic plate or something to protect the hose. I've got this guy on there for now, and that will probably work for now, but in the future that would be a major issue. That would definitely rub into that. So wiring up this will be the last thing that I really need to do, and I will have his help on that because I don't know how this all works. But we'll need to get the fuel pump wired into this with some kind of trigger on the ignition or something of that sort to figure out how it gets power, and then this will also power the ECU and the O2 sensor or the wideband and all that good stuff. I got the wires run into the car for it to give it power and a ground to ground the board. But from there, I'm at a little bit of a loss. But that will be for next time. We will hopefully be starting it, if all goes well. If it doesn't go well, who knows what we'll be doing. But that will be the end of major progress for this week. Now my focus shifts to doing work on this guy, which is a quote-unquote customer car. My Corvette is best Corvette because Ghost Flames.